Shadows and Mockery by Austin Clarke. Large hands grasped her from behind as she lay on her side half asleep. With a lack of tenderness verging on violence, she was hauled upright into a sitting position as if she was a rag doll. Where was the bedside manner? Wasn't she in a hospital? She tried to turn her head to face her attacker, but it could only have been a he, grabbed a handful of her hair and yanked her head back so viciously that she could only see the ceiling, her vision further compromised by sudden tears of pain. His other hand shot round to her face and clamped gauze material over her nose and mouth. No tender loving care in the force he used to achieve that either. The gauze was impregnated with a volatile liquid that stank like paint stripper. She struggled, but it was useless. He was far too strong, his grip relentless. Eventually she had to take a breath of whatever noxious concoction was on the gauze. As she did so, she felt a burning sensation in her throat and lungs, heard a rushing noise in her head, saw her vision distorting and blurring, and sensed nothing. She woke feeling groggy, nauseated, and with a thumping headache. She blinked owlishly. The room was dark. Shutters were closed across the window, but bright shafts of light around their edges showed that it was daylight outside. As her eyes became accustomed to the lack of light, she was almost lulled into a sense of security, until she realized she couldn't move. She had recognized where she was. Back in her familiar workplace, Hampton Court Palace, though in a room she visited infrequently. She was in the so-called Wolsey closet. She recognized the Tudor doorway and fireplace, the wood linen faux panelling of the walls, the painted panels above, and the painted Tudor ceiling with its badges and emblems just discernible in the gloom. But at the same time she realized she was strapped to a bed that shouldn't be there, flat on her back, pinioned, with her limbs spread-eagled like a starfish. Like a naked starfish, actually, because she realized she was stark naked, totally exposed. She remembered that the Wolsey rooms were temporarily closed to the public for urgent repairs to rotting floor timbers. No friendly person was going to stumble across her here. Tears of indignation and despair filled her eyes. Then she heard the footsteps. They were approaching with a heavy tread. Fear started to build in her, coming to a peak when the door was flung open, and two male figures were silhouetted in the entrance. She recognized them both instantly, and her fear turned to terror. Their shapes were all too familiar. One of them she had hoped and prayed never to set eyes on again. She realized that he would only be here if they planned to kill her. Terror engulfed her. She shrieked out Simon's name, then she lost control of her bladder, and shame and despair swept through her and carried her sanity away on its flood. His working day was drawing to its tedious close when the phone on his desk rang, just as Big Ben chimed out to the city of Westminster that it was 7 o'clock in the evening. He ignored the phone and continued to gaze through the window at the face of the famous clock on the other side of the river. He had no intention of responding to the strident demand to pick up the receiver. He seemed to have spent all afternoon doing nothing else. He'd had quite enough of today. He was tired of the interminable problems of patients, bored with the turgid routine of ward rounds and outpatient clinics, fed up with the endless infighting with one particular colleague. Tired, bored and fed up, in fact, with his whole working life. His real problem was that the other parts of his life were no better. The phone only stopped ringing after the last sombre hour chime had faded away somewhere in the depths of Lambeth. Persistent, whoever it was. 15 seconds respite, then his bleep started, and that he had to answer. He picked it from his pocket and pressed receive. "Simon?" Mandy's disembodied voice in not messing about mode and loud in his ear. "As soon as your phone starts ringing again, answer it." Mandy was sister in charge of the Department of Psychological Medicine. Simon Carlyle was one of the consultant psychiatrists attached to that department at St. Thomas's Hospital. Lay people think doctors rule hospitals. They don't. They especially don't at St. Thomas's. Doctors come way down the pecking order here. Nurses rule, a lasting legacy from Florence Nightingale. And you learn this pecking order very early on, if, as Simon was, you were also trained at St. Thomas's. As a post-second MB student, released upon the wards and an unsuspecting public, you literally fled if you happened upon the triumvirate of matron, deputy matron, and assistant matron on their daily tour of the hospital. And it wasn't only the students who fled. At the sight of the formidable trio, in their fantastic caps, dripping and bobbing with lace, eminent consultants, exalted stars of their professional disciplines, would flatten themselves against the walls of the corridors, or inexplicably have to turn back for something they'd forgotten, often with a bewildered troop of students U-turning behind. Department and ward sisters were not to be messed with either. Mandy especially. So Simon was being foolish when he argued that he was not on duty and did not want to speak to anyone else today. "Oh yes, you are, and oh yes, you do want to speak to this person," she said. "Why?" he stupidly asked. "Because I say so," was the predictable answer. So when his phone immediately started ringing again, he picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end, suave, cultured, and very, very assured, informed him that it belonged to the Comptroller General of Her Majesty's Royal Palaces, and that he, Dr. Carlyle, a psychiatrist researching the paranormal, was exactly the right person to help out with a certain matter. Would he mind kindly presenting himself tomorrow morning at Whitehall at 9 o'clock and asking for Sir Edmund Pemberley? Mind? "I shall have to clear things with my professor. I'm supposed to be taking an outpatient clinic," he stalled. "I don't doubt that's already in hand," the assured voice said in a tone of absolute certainty that clearly doubted nothing. It took Simon's bemused silence for assent. "Thank you so much. Until tomorrow morning, then. Come to the Whitehall entrance on Horse Guards Parade." There was a click as the phone line disconnected. Simon was not good at being taken for granted. He was going to find Prof. and find out what the hell was going on. So he grabbed the pile of notes he'd been working on, along with the tape of dictated letters to GPs, and threw them on the secretary's desk in passing. A band of light shone under the door to Prof's consulting room. He knocked. "Come in," commanded the calm voice. He did so. "Prof. Good evening, Simon." He'd obviously been waiting for him. On his otherwise clear desk, a copy of the Times lay folded at a completed cryptic crossword. "Prof, I've just been phoned by a man called Pemberley." "Sir Edmund," Prof interrupted. "Sir Edmund," Simon said, "who is demanding my presence in Whitehall tomorrow morning, won't take no for an answer, and seems to have arranged things with you already." He didn't add, without so much as a "by your leave." Agreed Prof. "So what the hell is going on?" "I'd rather Sir Edmund explained for himself, but I think you'll be interested." His eyes twinkled as he said this. "And I shall take your clinic for you tomorrow, happily." Oh yeah, happily indeed. He thought ruefully of the chaos of his average clinic, with emergencies tagged on and junior nurses struggling with unfamiliar tasks, compared with the smooth orderliness of Prof's, run of course by Mandy with her usual rod of iron. He must have looked sceptical. "Look, Simon, don't worry about your work here. This is going to be good for your research. It sounds mysterious and intriguing. You might even enjoy yourself. Your summons comes from a very high authority, you know." Yeah, but Prosser wouldn't know that, his colleague of the endless infighting. He'd just see it as Simon skiving off on more nonsensical research. Prosser didn't call it research, of course. He called it bollocks. A very high authority. Higher than Prof's, higher than Her Majesty's Comptroller. "Christ," he said aloud. "No, not quite as high as that, Simon." Prof got to his feet and headed for the door. "A beer?" he asked in passing. At 9 a.m. precisely, a youngish man of about his own age greeted Simon inside the main entrance to Whitehall. He wore a uniform as immaculate as those seen outside on Horse Guards parade. The preconception Simon had formed of Sir Edmund as a military man was looking good. "Colonel Blimp, here we come." The uniform led him up to the first floor and to a pair of stout oak doors, knocked, waited for the summons, opened one and ushered him inside. He closed the door behind Simon. At the far end of the room, a man left his desk and approached, hand extended. The handshake was firm and dry. "Dr. Carlyle, good of you to come." Where had been the choice, Simon wondered. "I apologize for the peremptory summons. I hope you'll understand when I've had a chance to explain." Simon made a placatory gesture. He had to revise his image. This tall patrician who greeted him was not a caricature Colonel Blimp at all. He had the erect military posture, but nothing else. His silver hair, brushed straight back from a broad brow, was too long by military standards. He wore an impeccably cut and understated dark suit with a discreetly unidentifiable tie. More a caricature of a courtier, Simon thought, which is exactly what he would be, of course. "Please take a seat." He gestured to one of a comfortable pair of chairs arranged either side of a large fireplace, sat himself in the other, and after inquiring, picked up a telephone and ordered coffee. They made small talk while they waited. Simon gave him the bare bones of his medical career to date, and nothing of his private life, and Sir Edmund told him how he knew Prof, and nothing else at all. He and Prof were acquaintances from Cambridge days. They had been in the same college, even had rooms sharing the same staircase. Perhaps this explained why Simon's name had come to his attention, as he was not exactly world-famous. Sir Edmund must have approached Prof as his first line of contact with the world of psychiatry, the old school-tie network alive and kicking. It might also explain why Prof was being so unusually amenable, happily taking Simon's clinic, for example. The door opened. A young woman brought in a tray with coffee, which smelled delicious, and bourbon biscuits, which looked bad for the waistline, a problem the young woman clearly did not have. To describe her as pretty would have been an understatement. She placed the tray on the low table between them. "Thank you, Alice," said Sir Edmund. She gave them both a shy smile, a flash of even teeth, and a glimpse of big green eyes beneath a heavy fringe made Simon's heart lurch. As she left, he couldn't prevent his eyes from following her. Stunning. Very, very classy. She might be French, he thought. Dr. Carlyle? Sir Edmund's tone was gently inquisitive. With a guilty start, he tore his gaze from her bottom. Was there a hint of amusement in those blue eyes? Dr. Carlyle, I understand that within your role as a consultant psychiatrist, you specialize in the paranormal. Do you believe in ghosts? He asked. Oh, God, here we go, and his very first question. I am open-minded about them. I've studied them now for 5 years, mainly, of course, to try to understand the potential relationship between such phenomena and mental illness. In that time I have experienced strange disturbances, which cannot be explained rationally. I have interviewed many people with convincing stories who genuinely believe they have experienced what we call haunting. By that I mean they have experienced the presence of a ghost. If ghosts exist, what I haven't done to date is manage to nail one. Nail one? Yes, I have not managed to capture on audio or videotape evidence of a ghostly event or haunting. Because they don't really exist, or because they defy the technology trying to record them? Oh, I'm sure they exist, because I have experienced strange events myself while trying to record them. I've heard strange noises and failed to record them. I've seen shadowy figures, and the same applies. No camera records them. We have noticed an association of changes in temperature with events, and less commonly flashing lights. We have successfully recorded both of these phenomena often. You said we? Yes, I work with an assistant, Adrian Bell. He looks after the technological side. It's not my field, but it's very much his. And the association with temperature, what happens? Usually, there is a drop in temperature just before an event takes place. The drop can be quite marked. We can record that change. The flashing lights? We call them orbs, because that's what they tend to look like when playing back film. They look like spherical concentrations of light, which sometimes flash across the camera field. More rarely, they hover. But you experience them as flashing lights? Yes, often fleeting, just glimpses. Do you have explanations for these recordings? Ones which would stand up to scientific scrutiny? Frankly, no. So what do you think is going on? You must have a theory. Simon hesitated to collect his thoughts and to avoid making outrageous claims. Sir Edmund waited. He didn't expound on his question. Well, I believe it's possible that energy might exist under certain circumstances which we cannot measure at present. We are designing equipment to monitor sound and vision beyond human ranges to see if we can record the phenomena that way. We have a monitor nearly ready to record within the infrared spectrum, and another one to record electromagnetic changes. We have just designed a thermal imaging camera which works well in tests. We have air movement detectors, pressure gauges, and humidity monitors. All of these try to capture proof of supernatural activity for the scientific community, to have something tangible to show. It doesn't alter the fact that many people have experienced ghosts, whether we manage to record them or not, and they see them in the human range, of course. So your theory? I suppose I believe in the experience more than the explanation. Something is responsible for people seeing, or feeling, or hearing what they believe to be ghosts. But if ghosts exist, I am unclear about their origin. I don't necessarily believe that they are earthbound spirits of dead people. I think it more likely that ghostly events are created unconsciously by living people. Disturbed adolescents have on occasions been implicated as the originators of poltergeist activity, for example. I've witnessed and documented a few of those cases myself. That's interesting. So you do believe in the existence of ghosts, but as an artifact of people's imaginations, rather than as a figment. Yes, but not even imagination. I think the events are possibly real encounters experienced by normal people. The people who experience ghosts are certainly not all deranged. Simon remembered feeling so confident as he expressed his theory on the subject to Sir Edmund at that moment. Well, they say ignorance is bliss, don't they? Sir Edmund put down his coffee cup with a sigh and leant forward. We have a problem at Hampton Court Palace, which my superiors would like to resolve. Have you heard of the haunted gallery? Yes, I have. I thought the haunted epithet was invented to generate extra tourist interest in the palace. I don't know about that, but long before tourists, staff at Hampton Court believed the tales of haunting to have been invented by some of the Grace and Favour residents who found the old Tudor state-rooms uncongenial as residential accommodation. The large and draughty rooms were notoriously difficult to keep warm. They even used the old Tudor kitchens as accommodation once upon a time. There were numerous requests to move people to cosier accommodation within the palace, many because of alleged haunting. My predecessors were inclined to move the complainers without necessarily believing the complaints. Something has happened to make you take the idea of haunting more seriously? For years we have received complaints of visitors feeling unwell while in the haunted gallery. We passed most off as suggestibility, but recently people have actually collapsed in the gallery. How many and over what time scale? Simon asked. 4 in the last 6 months. Sir Edmund looked a little uncomfortable and shifted in his chair. But all until last week made rapid recoveries. It seemed the victims all felt as if they'd been punched hard by something they couldn't see, fainted, came round feeling hot and pouring with sweat, and were fine once away from the gallery. All were in the same area of the gallery near the door to the chapel, but he hesitated, and Simon waited. 2 days ago an elderly American collapsed and died. Collapsed and died in the gallery? Not quite. He and an unrelated young woman in the same group collapsed simultaneously in the gallery. The American died later in Kingston Hospital. What was the cause of death? A massive heart attack, according to the post-mortem. What age was he, and was there any pre-existing disease? He was 73. The pathologist reported widespread severe arteriosclerosis. And the young woman? Recovered. She was discharged from Kingston later that same evening. She said something icy cold rushed through her and made her faint. It could have been a coincidence that the American collapsed in the gallery. It could have happened anywhere, at any time, Simon said. He could have become overwrought, if he was a suggestible sort, especially if his tour guide was recounting the tales about the ghost of Queen Catherine Howard haunting the gallery, which I believe they all like to do. Sir Edmund obviously judged this last comment to be a negative criticism. He replied quickly, and there was a sharp edge to his tone. Speculation about the cause is unhelpful, and it doesn't explain the young woman collapsing at the same time. The fact is that an American citizen, Wilbur Cross, collapsed in the Queen's Gallery at Hampton Court Palace and died shortly thereafter, only a few days ago, and my superior wants the whole matter investigated immediately. Simon tried to look contrite. He muttered an apology about voicing his thoughts too freely. His mind was elsewhere, however, his thoughts racing ahead. You can't discount group hysteria, and you cannot choose when to have a coronary thrombosis. But imagine being ordered to investigate such a celebrated haunting. An amazing opportunity. And who was Sir Edmund's superior? He or she was unlikely to be an equerry or a principal private secretary. He probably outranked them. Could it possibly be Her Majesty? Sir Edmund accepted the apology graciously enough, and spoke in his original calm tone, as if he had read Simon's mind. This is a direct command from Her Majesty. The Queen phoned me, and I phoned your professor. He is arranging for your NHS commitments to be covered as we speak. So this is a royal command. Incidentally, if you discover any evidence of haunting, true haunting, Her Majesty has commanded that an exorcism ceremony be performed. Tell me, Dr. Carlyle, are you religious? No, he said, his tone abrupt. He was not going down that route. If there was someone worth worshipping, he couldn't forgive him or her for Rosie. But you would have no objection to an exorcism being carried out? Simon knew nothing about exorcism. He remembered the Bible story about Christ casting out devils from a madman called Legion. But then, according to the Bible, Jesus also raised Lazarus from the dead. He knew leaders of the Roman Catholic faith were convinced of the reality of demonic possession. He was damn sure none of his psychotics were possessed by demons. He felt a sudden internal shudder, though, a psychic frisson. His mother had a phrase for the feeling. She used to say, "I've just felt someone walk over my grave." I would have no objection at all. When do I start? As soon as possible. If you go to Hampton Court tomorrow evening, Alice will take care of you. Alice? He asked disingenuously. Yes, the young lady who brought our coffee. Oh, he said. And fine, he thought, he added. Sir Edmund gave him an enigmatic look. Good, that's settled then. I should warn you. The American's wife who was with him said that he looked as if he'd been scared to death. Simon Carlyle walked back across Westminster Bridge from Whitehall towards St. Thomas's with an icy, easterly wind blowing hard in his face. May, for heaven's sake, and lowering grey clouds promised rain, in stark contrast to the last few days of spring sunshine. It felt cold enough to snow, but even the famously capricious weather couldn't dampen his spirits. He thought excitedly about the meeting. He had just been given a royal command to carry out the work he enjoyed doing most. A royal command! He had to keep mentally pinching himself. Sir Edmund Pemberley had seemed a prickly character, but given his exalted status and the pressure he must be under, that was understandable. Simon wondered how closely he would have to work with him. It was a daunting prospect. Perhaps he would just keep a close eye on Simon's progress, or lack of it. With a bit of luck, his only contact with him would be through that beautiful young woman, Alice. On such light-hearted ruminations, he entered St. Thomas's and went up to Scutari, the Crimean euphemism the Department of Psychological Medicine went under. To have his high spirits doused by a fraught atmosphere you could have cut with a knife. A pink and bristling receptionist stood quivering with indignation behind her reception desk, and a roomful of outpatients huddled in their seats, like infantry sheltering in their trenches from a barrage. There was no need to search far for the cause. He heard Pross's braying tones employing a string of insults. They sprayed from the doorway to Pross's consulting room, flung open suddenly by a young staff nurse, who shot from it looking even pinker and crosser than the receptionist. Simon felt his temper rising. How dare the idiot behave like this in front of patients? The staff nurse stopped in mid-flight when she saw Simon and dived into his consulting room. He followed her and closed the door behind him. "Okay, Sally, what's going on?" Sally spluttered with rage, tears not far below the surface. "That effing man! That bastard! She was forcing the consonant so hard she was sticking on it. "Bastard?" he said. She drew a deep breath and then gave him a rueful smile. "Yes, bastard, bastard, bastard. I'm sorry, but he is." "What's he done?" It's not what he's done, it's what he won't do that's the problem. She was still indignant, but calming down. Which is? We have 3 emergencies for urgent assessment this morning. He refuses to see any of them. He says he's too busy already and has an important appointment at the Maudsley later, which he cannot miss. This was typical of Prosser. No discussion offered, present Sally with a fait accompli, and ignore the problem. If he ducked hard enough, someone else, in this case guess who, would have to pick up the pieces. If pressed, he resorted to the sort of language they'd all just witnessed. "Did you pressurize him?" "No," Sally said. "All I did was ask. He did the rest for himself. Perhaps he feels guilty." "Fat chance of that. Your mistake was to ask. Mandy would have just told him." "By the way, is Mandy away?" Mandy was usually present during this outpatient session, and Prosser wouldn't have behaved like this if Mandy had been there. "Yes, her father is poorly again. She had to go up to Lancashire." Like all bullies, Gerald Arthur Prosser, known to his friends as Gap, and by Simon as something unprintable, was unable to resist exploiting weakness. Mandy being absent was a weakness. Prosser was a neuropsychiatrist, which meant that he specialized in the biochemistry of nerve transmission, and how psychiatric illness and psychotropic drugs affected that chemistry. He felt that looking after the clinical aspects of mental illness was rather beneath him. It wasn't. It was part of his contract, as it was part of Simon's. Normally he would confront Prosser and insist he took a share of the extra work. He felt a little flicker of guilt and pleasure at the thought that he would soon be informing Prosser that he was on sabbatical leave starting almost immediately. It made him magnanimous. "Put all 3 on my list." He saw the conflicting emotions cross Sally's face: surprise, almost shock, followed by gratitude. He recognized ruefully that he was not often so amenable himself. He sat at his desk waiting for the first patient and looking distractedly through the window at the river flooding under Westminster Bridge. The waters rolling gently south and a northbound river police launch surging downriver against the tide. What had the bane of his life said to Sally? That he had an important meeting at the Maudsley? What sort of meeting, he wondered. When he finished his clinic, he was too late to find out. Prosser had long since gone. One of the emergencies had taken a while to sort out. She was a young mother with puerperal psychosis who was distressed beyond coping with herself, let alone her baby, and suicidal, completely at the end of her tether. A bewildered and anxious husband had accompanied her. Simon judged her to be at such risk of committing suicide that he'd arranged for her immediate admission. He had expected strong resistance to her becoming an inpatient, especially so abruptly, if not from the woman herself, then from her husband, and he had been mentally preparing to go through the complicated act of sectioning her. However, she was compliant, and her husband was so relieved he broke down. There was even a fit and active grandmother, willing and able to help with her grandchild. That is an increasingly rare situation these days for some reason. So not as time-consuming as it might have been, but he could still have used Prosser's help with either of the other 2 emergencies, he thought wryly, as he left the department for the ward, already nearly an hour behind schedule. They'd caught that young mother in the nick of time, though. She was as close to the edge as anyone he'd seen recently. He was sure that after a few more hours, let alone days, she would have found her situation so intolerable that she would have done away with herself, baby or no baby. Strange how badly nature can get things. Strange that the immense hormonal surges and plunges that accompany childbirth can make the young mother's psyche so vulnerable. If she had succeeded in taking her own life, it would have been sad beyond irony, truly tragic. He that cuts off 20 years of life cuts off so many years of fearing death Yes, perhaps, dear Bard, but what about the baby? Simon mentally shook himself. Yes, well, he was going to pull her back from the brink, with a bit of luck. Some women with postpuerperal psychosis can be very resistant to treatment, but she had been a normal, carefree, bubbly young woman before her pregnancy and during it, by all accounts, so she should respond well. He made a mental note to keep in touch with the ward during his enforced absence, by royal command. His spirits rose again at the thought, and even higher as he pictured Pross's reaction when he learnt what was afoot. He checked that his new inpatient was settling in, she was, and left an urgent message for a meeting with Adrian in his lab tomorrow morning. Adrian always went to his lab on Saturday mornings to tinker, as he called it. Mid-afternoon. Not such bad timing for a journey to Hampton Court Palace, even on a Friday. To be shown around by Alice. He realized he'd been looking forward to this ever since he'd been told. The sun had come out. Things were looking up. She was standing in a pool of early evening sunlight, which streamed through the leaded west window above her, highlighting her straight, glossy hair. She was talking to the same young soldier who had escorted him to Sir Edmund the day before. His manner was flirtatious. Her manner, Simon was thrilled to see, was not. Was she aware how attractive she was? She turned and greeted Simon with the same heart-stopping smile she'd given him in Sir Edmund Pemberley's office. The uniform gave him a nod of acknowledgement, and with the expression of a task completed, left them. He concentrated on trying to behave normally, while she accepted his hand in greeting. He found doing so difficult. He was even more attracted at this range. He tried to sum up objectively what it was about her that had such an effect on him. He couldn't do it. Love at first sight, a meeting of souls. Buddhists believe this happens when old souls who have been lovers in earlier incarnations meet again. Or was it just chemistry, pheromones clicking with each other? He couldn't explain what he was feeling except that it was thrilling, a little frightening, and it wasn't just lust. He told her his name, his voice sounding unnatural to his own ear. Her voice, when she replied, had a pleasing timbre, low and breathy. Alice Charrington, pleased to meet you. He really hoped she was, because a more accurate description of how he felt about meeting her would have been ecstatic or stunned. Simon was given a personal guided tour of the palace which he would never forget. He was distracted most of the time, which he hoped he concealed. Alice had expert knowledge and was easy to listen to. It was clear that her favourite parts of the palace were the few Tudor remains. Wren's rebuilding programme for King William and Queen Mary would have destroyed everything from the old palace except the Great Hall, if they hadn't run out of money, Alice explained. Even so, all that remains of the Tudor palace in anything like the original design are the staterooms and the kitchens. The Wolsey rooms were refitted, and the central gatehouse lowered by 2 stories from that built by Wolsey because it was found to be unstable, Alice said. The old medieval kitchens were vast, and Simon couldn't help dwelling on Tudor gluttony. Enough capacity to feed the king's household of 1,200 was built into 50 rooms round the kitchens and courtyard, some 3,350 square metres of food-producing space, said Alice, and 3/4 of the Tudor diet was meat. So much of it was devoted to butchery. No change there, then, Simon thought to himself, given the struggles of the hospital dietitians to improve the diets of the population of South London. He wouldn't have cared to live in the kitchens as a Grace and Favour apartment either, he thought, remembering Pemberley's comment. But he didn't think for long, because Alice beckoned him to follow her up a worn staircase from the kitchens to the serving area above. He followed close behind, his distraction peaked. He reminded himself not to walk close behind her, especially upstairs or steps, if he wanted to do anything sensible immediately afterwards. "Come on, for God's sake, get a grip. Where the hell is this coming from?" he said to himself, and then worried that he might have said it aloud. He needed to stop this regrettable train of thought. It was inappropriate to be shown around the palace in this dream state of sexual fantasy. Try conversation, any conversation. "What does your work entail when you're not showing people like me around?" he asked. She looked back over her shoulder. "I'm the chief historian for all the royal palaces," she replied, "in charge of all the archives, and I'm responsible for the presentation of that history to the public." "Heavens, I feel honoured. I apologize for taking you from your work. This must be a bore for you." "Not at all," she smiled faintly. "It's a pleasure. I get very bored with my own company sometimes." "You work alone?" "Mostly." He was itching to ask. He couldn't help himself. "Anyone in your life outside work to mitigate it?" His question was met with silence initially, during which he squirmed with embarrassment inside while he tried to give the impression of mildly friendly inquisitiveness outside. "Not really," she said finally, in a quiet voice. She looked straight at him as she said this, and he saw the conflict in her eyes. Time to drop it, he thought to himself. "Well, I'm genuinely honoured to be shown around by you." He wished he'd never opened his mouth. "And it's genuinely my pleasure to do so," she said. The slight awkwardness he had suddenly felt between them seemed to dissipate. "I am looking forward to this investigation and very interested to see what you'll find." At the top, the Tudor staircase led to a room originally designed to allow the servers carrying the food to assemble, before taking it either left into the great watching chamber where the senior courtiers ate with the king, or right into the great hall where the rest of the household ate. It was called the horn room because all the horns and antlers that had decorated the galleries of the old Tudor apartments were stored there after the demolitions ordered by William III. It would have been well named for his current emotional state, Simon thought. Alice led him into the great watching chamber. Simon was impressed by its ornate Tudor ceiling, but it had little effect on his distraction. The next room did, though. Simon felt uncomfortable as soon as they entered it. Passing a small, insignificant pages room, they entered an unimpressive corridor, which looked as if it turned through a right angle at its far end. "The haunted gallery?" he asked Alice. She gave him a small grimace and nodded. "Yes." "You don't like it either?" "No, not really, but I always tell myself it's my imagination. This palace is reputed to be one of the most haunted buildings in Great Britain." "You haven't seen anything?" "No, just felt. Atmospheres." They walked down the first limb, past a fireplace and 2 staircases to the end, where it turned right into another stretch of corridor, longer, but no more impressive. Suddenly he felt very uncomfortable. The power of suggestion? Alice noticed his involuntary shiver. "It does that to me too." "What do you feel in here?" he asked her. "A strong feeling of sadness and despair." "Yes, that's what I'm feeling." As they walked down this second length, he felt the sensation growing stronger. On the left a little way down was a single Tudor door. It looked long disused and foreshortened, as if it had been designed for a different floor height. This felt to him like the focus of the discomfort. "What's behind this door?" he asked. "That was the entrance to the King's pew in Henry VIII's time," Alice said. When Henry was in residence, every morning he would walk from his private apartments through the great watching chamber and along the Queen's gallery to that door. It was the one opportunity for the majority of the courtiers and outsiders to see their monarch, to speak to him and be noticed by him. Can you imagine this corridor in the great watching chamber filled with a throng of pleading, scheming, competing, striving men and women every morning? You can feel an echo of that in the watching chamber, but in the gallery the feeling is darker. I feel profound misery here. He tried opening the door. It was locked. Alice had moved ahead of him, further down the gallery, as if reluctant to stand in front of it, and gestured to another similar doorway near the far end. And this one was the Queen's pew. Kings' and Queen's pews like church pews? Yes and no. Yes, they were massive private pews in one sense. They were known as the Holy Day closets, but they also acted as private offices. They were mirror-image rooms, separated by a half-glazed partition wall, with identical floor space, identical fireplaces on the outer walls, and identical half-glazed end walls which looked down into the body of the royal chapel. Is this where they would have attended services? Yes, with their closest retinues, but separated from the rest of the household in the body of the chapel, and from each other, though they could see each other. In any case, Henry would have heard Mass in his apartments before he got there, and that, she gestured at a large annex with double doors set between the Tudor ones, was the later entrance to the royal pew when the monarch and his queen were no longer glazed in and separated. She said this with a wry smile. Although they left the old doors, they demolished the old Holy Day closets behind them. She pointed to the end of the gallery where there was a William and Mary doorway. In Tudor times, the entrance to the Queen's apartments was through there. There was an impressive Tudor archway, the Queen's apartments interconnected with the King's, behind the scenes, so to speak. Wren demolished the whole lot. She led him back the way they'd come. As they passed the grim-looking door to Henry's pew, she gestured to it with distaste. Henry did a lot of his work closeted in that room with Cromwell or Cranmer leading him on. She didn't enlighten him about whether that work was good or evil. That door, legend has it, is the one Queen Catherine Howard hammered at to no avail, when trying to reach Henry to plead for her life, and it's just there that the tourists collapse. As he returned to London through the usual heavy traffic on the A3, Simon thought about the rest of the visit. After showing him the palace, it had seemed natural to show him the palace grounds. Nobody else was about. They wandered along avenues towards the riverbank and through overgrown formal gardens to the banqueting house. She showed him the maze, the orangery, and the great vine planted by Capability Brown, the oldest known vine in England, she said. Then took him through the wilderness area with its carpet of wild flowers and daffodils, past the ruined Tiltyard Tower, a relic of the days of jousting, and back to her office just as darkness was falling. They bundled documents and vellum manuscripts into the boot of his car, obligatory reading courtesy of Sir Edmund, Alice explained. Then they paused, looking at each other in the gloom. "I hope you found the tour helpful." "Delightfully so, thank you," he said. He was thinking how easily they had slipped into a friendly intimacy while walking around the grounds, after the awkwardness he'd caused with his intrusive question about a partner in her life. Obviously too far, too soon. "And thank you for showing me the, grounds." It had definitely eased the slight tension he had detected. "Well, I thought you'd better see everything." If she was blushing, he couldn't see it. Dusk was deepening rapidly, but her voice was calm. Don't start imagining things that aren't there, he told himself, but he was imagining, even so. Good luck with the reading. I hope you can understand the older records. Some of the English is very quaintly archaic. Medieval English is not a strong point of mine. If you get stuck, I'll help out when you come back. Simon decided he would make quite sure he got stuck. Thank you very much indeed. I'll get our equipment together as soon as possible, hopefully by Monday afternoon. Will you be here then? Oh yes, she said brightly. I'm instructed to look after you for the extent of the investigation. Oh God, yes, please, Simon thought. Great. Until Monday then. His voice sounded unnatural again. Yes, bye, she said in a friendly tone. Until Monday then. Have a good weekend. Yes, and you. She turned away. He watched her walk all the way to her car. Simon left Hampton Court, feeling excited and elated. He felt like a teenager again, and now, just like a teenager's, his mood suddenly ricocheted in the opposite direction, plunging him into tearful shakiness as he sat in ridiculous traffic on the Fulham Road. What was he thinking about? He didn't know the woman. She was unlikely to be feeling what he was feeling. For all he knew, she was happily married. He certainly hadn't established that she wasn't. Her enigmatic answer to his question hadn't really answered anything. He was so smitten that he hadn't even noticed whether she wore a wedding ring. Anyway, she was unlikely to be as damaged or as lonely as he. He'd invested far too much emotion in that early evening walk. Love at first sight. Stupid and ridiculous. But the French had a phrase for it too, didn't they? A coup de foudre, or something like that. So he wasn't unique. He was in turmoil as he turned into Yeoman's Row, the excitement clashing violently with his grief. Guilt was the result. The beautiful little house in the Knightsbridge cul-de-sac would have been way beyond his means. It had been bequeathed him by his childless Aunt May, his mother's elder sister, who had been his proxy mother. She had made only two provisos: that he didn't sell it and lived in it, easy stipulations to obey, since he loved the house as much as she had. He had also shared it, too briefly, with a young wife whom he had loved even more, and for whom his grieving seemed unending. He retrieved the post from the doormat, kicking the door shut behind him, juggling with keys, post, and Sir Edmund's obligatory reading. The house was cool and quiet. He'd just about reached the stage where he no longer called out Rose's name each time he got in, still expecting a response. For months, the ensuing silence had been shocking. He had finally reconciled himself to the fact that she was not going to come running out of the kitchen and into his arms ever again. He dumped the reading material on the desk and went in search of a whiskey. He poured himself a modest one. He had tried immodest ones too in the dark early days after Rosie had died. They made things 100 times worse. He slumped onto the sofa and thought about the prospect of monitoring the Queen's gallery. He had never been anywhere before which made him feel so uncomfortable. Yes, of course it could be nothing more than suggestion, but he wasn't alone in feeling so ill at ease. So had Alice. Alice, what was that woman going to do to him? Pull him from his dark pit, or give him nothing more than the turmoil of guilt and the self-disgust of a brief fling? And hang on, Mr. Arrogant, where did you gain the impression she felt the same? She did, though. Instinctively, he knew she did. He sipped whiskey and thought about that. She'd certainly stopped him thinking about Prosser. Prosser had tended to be the subject of his unwinding thoughts most evenings. He, and of course, always and unendingly, Rosie. He felt guilty about his feelings for this new woman. Too deep, too soon. He felt excited at the chance to explore the haunted gallery, but he felt a deeper, more atavistic fear, a tremor of evil and danger. But he was moved more deeply still by the tremors of love. Could this woman really help him to move on, to get on with his life without Rosie? Could this woman cure his grief? Rosie had been standing in front of the bathroom mirror that night, toweling herself after her bath. She was looking at the reflection of her breasts rather quizzically, he thought. She should have no worries there. Despite being slender, like many American Caucasian women, she was well endowed in that department and also possessed height and long, shapely legs. He found the scene stimulating, so he dropped his bath towel and stood close behind her, cupping her breasts in his hands, nuzzling her buttocks with his genitals, and looking at their combined reflection with pleasurable arousal. It was then that he felt it. Rosie saw the look on his face. "What is it?" she asked. "Oh, probably nothing," he lied. She read his anxiety straight away. No doubt she could also feel the arousal draining from him. "Oh, come on, Simon, tell me," she said, not to be deflected. "Well," he hesitated, "I think I can feel a lump here deep in." He felt her right breast with more science and less sex, and his blood ran cold. She had a discreet lump, which clearly wasn't tender, deep in her breast, but what alarmed him was that it was tethered to tissues even deeper. She allowed him to feel her right armpit. She had palpable lymph nodes there, and one of those was immovable too. "You didn't know you had a lump there?" "No." "You never felt any pain or discomfort?" "No," she repeated in the same flat voice. She looked deep into his eyes. He was no actor, and she clearly didn't like what she saw. He tried to be nonchalant, but his tone grated horribly. "Well, let's not cross any bridges until we get to them, eh? Better get you seen, though, as soon as we can, don't you think?" They spent a sleepless night in each other's arms. He knew she didn't sleep from her breathing, and he knew this because he couldn't either. They said nothing to each other, though. There wasn't much to say. His mind was full of terrified love for her, and he could not, dared not, express that terror. The following morning, Rosie was seen by one of Simon's colleagues, a very senior consultant surgeon, for whom he had worked as a junior. After she had carried out her examination of Rosie, Miss Harker spoke to them both in careful, gentle, sombre tones, which even without her guarded and regretful facial expression, told a death knell for Rosie as far as he was concerned. In view of the nature of the breast lump, she recommended CT scans of much of Rosie's body, including her head, to be conducted as a matter of urgency. She would operate to remove the lump straight away, principally so its histology could be established. A couple of days later, the colleague summoned Simon to her room. She had already spoken to Rosie, and Rosie wanted Miss Harker to tell him. She couldn't face telling him herself. He didn't need telling. He sat feeling cold and numb, and went to some quiet, dark place inside himself, somewhere away from the pain, frightened that it was going to overwhelm him otherwise. It was curtains, as he had known it would be. Examination of the lump had shown its cellular content to consist of very poorly differentiated cells, making it aggressively malignant. Ironically, this tends to be the case when breast cancer appears in women as young as Rosie. The curtains bit, though, was in the scans. They had shown secondaries in the lungs, liver and brain. Rosie was logically beyond help from surgery, radiotherapy or chemotherapy. Rosie didn't have very long left, and Louise Harker wanted Simon to help Rosie to decide what action if any, should be taken. Radical mastectomy would have been the obvious course if the cancer had been discovered early enough. It was a mutilating operation and, under the circumstances, not justified. The same could be said for the alternatives. Radiotherapy could be tried on individual secondaries if they caused symptoms, to try to reduce the tumor's size or at least to limit the rate of growth, but it wasn't going to cure anything and could be unpleasantly painful. Chemotherapy was going to knock all her hair out, make her feel ill, and achieve bugger all. "A great choice, Louise, if I might say so," he said. "I suppose we have to be grateful that she's in no pain, so far. That's a bit surprising, isn't it?" "Frankly, yes. If she had secondaries in bone, I would have expected her to present with pain. Thank God she has no sign of any. On the other hand, it is why she has presented so late." It was 24 hours later, and he was holding Rosie's hand tight in his as they sat opposite Louise. "What would you do?" Rosie asked. Louise looked at her unblinkingly for a short while. Miss Harker was one of the most respected consultants at St. Thomas's. Her opinion was valued for her common sense and no-nonsense approach to problems. She was also renowned for her bluntness and courage. There was a weighty silence, then at last she spoke. "Nothing," she said firmly. "No surgery, no radiotherapy, no chemotherapy. Any intervention is going to cause suffering, and it is not going to cure the disease. Break into your savings and do the things you would regret not having done. Make the most of the time you have left. I am sincerely sorry that I can do nothing to prolong it, and even sorrier that it is likely to be short." Simon glanced at Rosie to see how she had taken it, fearful that she would collapse. She sat very pale and very still, but, to his amazement, the slightest hint of a smile teased the corner of her mouth. "Thank you, Miss Harker," she had said softly, "for your honesty and courage."